"You don't remember the river, Cowboy. I'm the girl who gave you that stone," said the Apache woman. Mesquite Bend, Texas. Late autumn 1884. The wind carried dust through the broken fence posts, turning the air the color of old copper. Silas Mercer rode his horse slowly along the property line, watching the surveyor stakes that had appeared like grave markers across land that had known his family for 30 years. Each wooden peg bore a red ribbon that snapped in the wind, bright, deliberate, claiming he was 34. Before this, he'd worked cattle drives, buried a wife to fever, and learned that silence suited a man better than company. The nearest town was 6 miles east, through scrub and stone. He hadn't spoken to anyone in 4 days. His hat was old leather, sweat-stained at the band, and tied to the brim with a red thread was a flat river stone, smooth as skin, pale as bone. He'd worn it since he was 9 years old. He didn't remember why he'd kept it, only that removing it felt like forgetting something sacred. That afternoon, he dismounted near the river. The Mesquite flowed low and slow brown water over white sand, cutting through cottonwood and willow. This was where he'd played as a boy before the war, before the railroad men came with their maps and money. He crouched by the water's edge. The current whispered against the rocks. Somewhere in his chest, memory stirred a girl's laughter. Small hands placing a stone in his palm, a voice saying, "The river will remember, even if you forget." He touched the stone on his hat. The thread was frayed now, but it held. The light dimmed. Shadows pooled beneath the trees. He stood turned toward home and did not see the smoke rising beyond the bend. Morning came with fog. Silas woke to the smell of wood smoke drifting through his window. Not his own fire, but something older. Something carried on wind that didn't blow from town. The scent was different from pine or mesquite. It held the weight of ritual, of prayers spoken in a language the land itself remembered. He lay still for a moment, listening. Through the gaps in the cabin walls, he heard nothing but the rustle of cottonwood leaves and the distant murmur of the river. But the smoke was there, threading through the dawn like a ghost returning home. He dressed slowly, pulling on worn canvas trousers and a shirt with buttons that no longer matched. His boots were cracked at the heels, the leather softened by years of dust and water. He didn't bother with coffee. Something in the air told him he needed to see this for himself. Outside, the fog clung low to the ground, turning the world gray and soft. His horse, a roan mare named Dust, stamped her feet and snorted as he approached. He saddled her with the ease of repetition, checked the cinch twice, and swung up. The ride to the river took 15 minutes. He followed the narrow trail that wound between scrub oak and prickly pear, the same path he'd walked as a boy, the same stones, still jutting from the earth like old teeth. The fog thickened as he neared the water, and for a moment he felt as though he were riding into memory itself. Then he saw them, through the mist canvas. Shelters rose like pale ghosts along the far bank. Low fires burned in stone circles, their smoke climbing straight into the windless air. People moved quietly between the trees. Women tending cook fires, men repairing travel packs, children sitting close to the flames with blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Apache, a traveling group, maybe 15, camped on the far bank where the old burial ground lay hidden beneath grass and thyme. Silas had heard the rumors in town. The railroad planned to cut through here, dig up the graves, pour gravel, and lay track. The company had paid the county. Money changed hands in offices far from the river, in rooms where no one had to look at the land they were selling. The dead, it seemed, had no lawyers. He dismounted and let Dust drink from the shallows. The water ran clear over white sand, cold enough to numb his fingers when he bent to touch it. Across the river, the camp continued its quiet morning rhythm. No one looked at him. No one waved him away. Then he saw her. A woman knelt by the river's edge, filling a clay jug. She wore a simple dress, dark blue, faded at the shoulders, and her hair was braided with a strip of white cloth that caught the early light. Her hands moved with practiced grace, dipping the jug into the current, letting it fill slowly so the sediment wouldn't rise. When she looked up, her eyes met his across the water. He froze. There was something in her face, something that pulled at the edges of a memory he couldn't name. Not recognition exactly. More like the feeling of standing in a place you'd dreamed about but never visited. Her eyes were dark, calm, and when she held his gaze, she didn't look away or lower her head. She simply watched him, as if waiting for him to remember something he'd forgotten long ago. The fog shifted between them, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw a young girl standing in her place, barefoot, laughing, holding out a smooth river stone in her small palm. Then the vision passed. She stood slowly, holding the jug against her hip. Water dripped from its rim, darkening the fabric of her dress. Her voice carried over the water, calm and low like the river itself. The river hasn't changed. Only people have. He didn't answer, didn't know what to say. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning he couldn't quite grasp. She turned and walked back toward the camp, her footsteps silent on the sand. He watched until she disappeared behind a canvas shelter, then stood there a moment longer, feeling as though he'd just been asked a question he didn't know how to answer. When he finally mounted his horse and rode home, the fog was lifting, but the weight in his chest remained. That night, Silas lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling beams. Moonlight filtered through the single window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn wood. Outside, a coyote called from the hills, and somewhere farther off an owl answered, but Silas didn't hear them. His mind kept circling back to her face, her voice, the way she'd looked at him as if she knew something he'd forgotten. The river hasn't changed. Only people have. What did that mean? Was it a warning? A greeting? A memory? He turned onto his side, then onto his back again. Sleep wouldn't come. Finally, near midnight, it found him, and with it came the dream. In the dream, he was 9 years old again, barefoot in the shallows. The sun was high and hot, turning the water into 1,000 points of light. He splashed through the current, chasing minnows, laughing at nothing and everything. A girl his age sat on a flat rock nearby Apache, her feet dangling in the water. She wore a simple tunic and a necklace of small stones that clicked softly when she moved. Her hair was long and black, tied back with a strip of leather. She was teaching him to read the surface of the water, how to know when rain was coming. By the way the current shifted, how to find the deep pools where the big fish hid, how to listen to the river's voice and understand what it was saying. "You're not listening," she said, her voice patient but firm. "I am," he protested. "No, you're hearing. That's different." She leaned forward, her hand moving in slow circles just above the water. "The river knows everything. It remembers the people who drink from it, the animals that cross it, the storms that fill it. If you listen, it will tell you." He tried to listen, closed his eyes, heard only the rush of current over stone. Then he lost his balance and fell backward into the water. He came up sputtering, and the girl laughed, not at him, but with him, the kind of laughter that held no cruelty. She reached out with both hands and pulled him upright, her grip strong and sure. "You'll learn," she said. Before she left that day, she gave him a stone. It was smooth and flat, pale as bone, worn by centuries of water. She pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers around it. "Keep this," she said, "so the river knows you." He wanted to ask her name, wanted to know when he'd see her again, but she was already running bare feet, flashing across the sand, disappearing into the trees like smoke. He never saw her again, until now. Silas woke with his heart pounding. The room was dark. His breath came fast and shallow. Sweat cooled on his forehead. The stone, the one on his hat. He sat up, swung his legs over the side of the bunk, and reached for the peg where his hat hung. His hands were shaking as he untied the red thread and held the stone in his palm. It was the same shape, the same weight. Smooth as water, pale as memory. 25 years, and he'd never asked himself where it came from. He'd worn it every day of his adult life, tied to his hat like a talisman, and never once wondered about the small hands that had given it to him. He stood in the darkness, barefoot on cold floorboards, and felt the world tilt beneath him. The woman by the river, the girl in the dream, they were the same. He dressed in the dark, fumbling with buttons, pulling on boots without bothering to tie them. He saddled dust by moonlight and rode hard toward the river, the stone clenched tight in his fist. The fog had returned thicker now, and the world felt like a held breath. When he reached the water's edge, he dismounted and stood alone in the silence, waiting for dawn, waiting for her, waiting to ask the question he should have asked 25 years ago. "Do you remember me?" The twist dawn was breaking when he reached the camp. Most of the shelters were still quiet, smoke curling lazily from banked fires. He dismounted and walked toward the water where the woman from yesterday stood alone watching the sunrise. She turned before he reached her. "You came back," she said. "I need to ask you something." She tilted her head, waiting. "Did you?" He stopped, feeling foolish. "Did you give me this?" He held up the stone. Her expression didn't change, but something softened in her eyes. "You were kind to me once," she said quietly, "when no one else was." The memory hit him like a fist. He was 9. A group of white boys had cornered an Apache girl by the creek, throwing stones, calling her names. He'd stepped between them, took a rock to the shoulder, told them to leave her alone. They'd laughed and walked away. The girl had stayed. She'd given him the stone as thanks, then disappeared into the hills. Ayana, he said, the name surfacing from somewhere deep. She nodded. You remember, I didn't. Not until now. She looked at him for a long moment, then glanced past him toward the far bank, where surveyors were already setting up equipment, preparing to mark the burial ground for excavation. They're going to dig up your people, Silas said. They already have permission. That doesn't make it right. She met his eyes again. And what will you do about it? Cowboy, he didn't have an answer. But then she said something that changed everything. The foreman Hammond, he was one of those boys, the ones who threw stones at me that day. Silas's jaw tightened. You sure I never forget a face? The air between them grew heavy. Silas looked toward the surveyors, then back at Ayana. Then he's not just stealing land, Silas said slowly. He's finishing what he started. Ayana's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. He doesn't know I'm here, but when he sees me, he will. Silas felt something shift inside him, a line he hadn't known he was standing on suddenly crossed. Then we'd better be ready. By noon, clouds rolled in from the west, dark and low. Thunder growled in the distance like a sleeping beast turning over. The air grew heavy, pressing down on the land with the weight of coming rain. Birds fell silent. The cottonwoods along the riverbank bent their heads as if in prayer. Silas had ridden back to his cabin to gather rope and nails, his saddlebag stuffed with whatever he thought might help secure the camp against the storm. He'd seen weather like this before, the kind that didn't ask permission, that tore roofs off barns and turned dry creek beds into rushing torrents in minutes. When he returned to the river, the wind was already tearing at the canvas shelters along the bank. People scrambled to secure their belongings, pressing stones against the edges of blankets, tying down packs, gathering children close. An old man shouted instructions in Apache, pointing toward the trees where the ground rose higher. Women wrapped cooking pots in cloth and carried them away from the water. The fires had already been doused, leaving only wet ash and the smell of smoke on the wind. Then Silas saw her. Ayana's tent was collapsing, one corner already pulled free, the canvas snapping and billowing like a living thing trying to escape. She fought to hold it down, her hands gripping the fabric as the wind tried to rip it from her grasp. He didn't ask permission, just dismounted and ran. His boots hit the sand hard as he reached her, grabbing the loose corner of the tent and throwing his weight against it. The wind pushed back, fierce and relentless. He could feel the strain in his shoulders, the burn in his forearms. Stakes, he shouted over the roar of the storm. She understood immediately. While he held the canvas down, she drove stakes deeper into the ground, using a flat stone as a hammer, her movements quick and sure despite the wind whipping her braid across her face. He passed her rope from his pack, and together they lashed the corners tight, reinforcing what the storm had tried to tear apart. Thunder cracked directly overhead, close enough to feel in his chest. The first drops of rain hit like thrown stones. Inside, Ayana said, pulling back the tent flap. They ducked through just as the sky opened. The shelter was small, barely large enough for two people to crouch without their shoulders touching. But it held. The canvas drummed with rain, a steady percussion that filled the space with sound. Water ran in rivulets down the sides, pooling at the edges where the stakes held firm. Silas sat back on his heels, breathing hard. His shirt was soaked through, clinging to his back. His hat dripped water onto the dirt floor. Across from him, Ayana wiped rain from her face with the back of her hand, her breath coming just as fast as his. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the storm raged. Wind howled through the cottonwoods. Lightning flashed bright enough to turn the canvas walls translucent for a heartbeat. Thunder followed, shaking the ground beneath them. But inside the shelter, there was only the two of them, and the sound of rain. Silas could smell sage and wood smoke in the fabric scents that had soaked into the canvas from countless fires, from ceremonies and meals and quiet nights under open sky. He could hear Ayana's breath close beside him, steady, now calming. She reached for a blanket, folded in the corner, and spread it across the dirt floor, creating a dry place to sit. Then she settled, cross-legged, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. Silas shifted to give her more room, but the space was too small. Their knees almost touched. You didn't have to help, she said finally. Didn't have to watch it blow away either. She studied him in the dim light. Rain blurred the world outside, turning everything gray and distant. You're the boy from the river. It wasn't a question. I didn't remember, he said quietly. Not until last night. Memory is like that. It hides until it's ready to be found. He pulled the river stone from his pocket. He'd taken it off his hat that morning, held it in his hand as he rode. Now he held it out to her. You gave this to me. 25 years ago. She looked at it but didn't take it. You kept it. Every day since. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile but close. "The river remembers," she said softly. "Even when we forget." Thunder rolled again farther away now. The worst of the storm was passing, but the rain continued steady and relentless. Ayanna pulled a small leather pouch from her belt and opened it carefully. Inside were seeds, dozens of them, small and dark, no bigger than grains of rice. She held the pouch toward him so he could see. "Willow," she said. "We plant them where the land bleeds to hold the soil together. Their roots go deep. They remember water even in drought." Silas looked at the seeds, then at her face. "You're planting them here, at the burial ground. If we cannot stop the railroad with words, we will stop it with roots." He was quiet for a moment, listening to the rain. Then he said, "I'll bring nails where it breaks." She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time he saw something other than wariness in her eyes. Trust. It was fragile, newly formed, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through winter earth. But it was there. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. "Because it's right. That's not enough for most people." "Then I'm not most people." She tilted her head slightly, considering. "No, you're not." Outside, the rain began to ease. The drumming on the canvas softened to a whisper. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called tentative, testing the air. Ayanna carefully tied the pouch closed and set it aside. Then she reached for a clay cup and poured water from a leather flask. Not river water, but something she'd been saving. She offered it to him. "Drink," she said. "You're shaking." He hadn't noticed, but she was right. His hands trembled slightly, whether from cold or adrenaline, or something else he couldn't say. He took the cup and drank. The water was cool and clean, tasting faintly of clay and minerals. "Thank you," he said, handing it back. She drank from the same cup without hesitation, a small gesture, but one that carried weight. In some cultures, sharing a cup meant kinship, meant you trusted the other person not to poison you, not to wish you harm. "When I was a girl," Ayanna said quietly, "my grandmother told me the river has two memories. One is the water itself. It remembers everything it touches. The other is the stones at the bottom. They don't move. They stay, even when everything else is washed away." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "You are like the stones, I think. You stayed." Silas didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But something in his chest loosened like a knot finally coming undone. The rain stopped. Silence filled the space where the storm had been. Not empty silence, but the kind that feels full, like the pause between breaths. Ayanna lifted the tent flap and looked outside. The sky was still gray, but lighter now. Puddles reflected the clouds, and the air smelled clean-washed. "It's over," she said. Silas stood brushing dirt from his knees. "I should check the stakes, make sure everything holds. I'll help." They stepped out into the aftermath. The camp had survived. A few shelters had lost corners, and one fire pit had filled with water. But the people were already setting things right, retying ropes, wringing out blankets, coaxing new fires to life with dry tinder, kept safe in sealed baskets. Silas walked the perimeter with Ayanna, testing each stake, tightening each knot. They worked side by side without speaking, their movements, synchronized by shared purpose. When they finished, the sun broke through the clouds just for a moment, just long enough to cast long shadows and turn the wet earth golden. Ayanna returned to her shelter and retrieved the leather pouch of willow seeds. She set it carefully on the wooden crate that served as a table, placing it in a patch of sunlight. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out the riverstone. He placed it beside the pouch. Two symbols, earth and memory. Ayanna looked at them, then at him. Neither of them said what it meant, but both of them knew. The river remembered, and now so did they. As Silas rode home that evening, the sky cleared completely. Stars appeared one by one, cold and distant. But when he looked back toward the river, he saw firelight glowing among the trees, and he knew he would return, not because he had to, because he wanted to. 2 days later, word spread through town Hammond's crew would begin excavation at the burial ground within the week. The railroad had filed the final permits. The dead would be moved or buried deeper. The news came from the county office, delivered by a clerk, who posted the notice on the church door and the general store window. Black ink on white paper, signed and sealed as official as death. The excavation would begin at dawn on Saturday. Any interference would be met with arrest. Silas read the notice twice, standing in the dusty street with his hat in his hands. Around him, townspeople passed by, some pausing to read, others walking on without interest. A woman in a gray dress shook her head and muttered something about progress. A shopkeeper sighed and said it was a shame, but what could anyone do? Silas folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket. Then he rode to the river. He found Ayanna and her people building a low fence of woven willow branches along the edge of the gravesite. The structure was barely 3 feet high, made of slender green branches bent and twisted together in a pattern that reminded him of basket weaving. It wouldn't stop a crew with shovels, wouldn't even slow them down, but it was something. A boundary, a stand. Ayanna worked at the center, her hands moving with practiced grace as she wove the branches through vertical posts. Her braid hung over one shoulder, and there was dirt on her dress from kneeling in the soil. An older man worked beside her, his face weathered as old leather, his hands gnarled but steady. 2 younger women carried armfuls of willow branches from the riverbank, their footsteps silent on the grass. No one spoke. Silas dismounted and stood at the edge of the clearing watching. He felt like an intruder, but also like someone who'd been expected. Ayanna looked up and saw him. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. "You heard," she said. "I heard. Then you know what's coming." "I do." She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "This fence won't stop them. I know. Then why are you here?" He looked at the fence, at the careful weaving, at the way the green willow branches bent without breaking. "Because you are." Something passed between them, an understanding that needed no elaboration. Silas walked to the pile of posts stacked near the tree line. He picked up a heavy wooden stake, found a stone to use as a hammer, and drove it into the ground at the edge of the burial site. The earth was hard resisting at first, then yielding. He set the post deep, tested it with his weight, and drove it deeper still. Ayanna brought willow branches and began weaving them through the post he'd set. They worked side by side, not speaking, letting the rhythm of labor say what words couldn't. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, hot and bright, then softened into afternoon gold. Silas's shirt grew damp with sweat. His hands blistered, then calloused over. Ayanna worked without stopping, her movements steady and unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world, and none at all. The older man, Ayanna's uncle Silas, learned, later showed him how to bend the willow branches, so they wouldn't snap, how to weave them tight enough to hold, but loose enough to flex in the wind. The 2 younger women brought water in clay cups, offered without words, received with gratitude. By dusk, the fence stood fragile but deliberate. It circled the burial ground, completely marking the boundary between the living and the dead, between what could be taken and what must be protected. Ayanna knelt at the base of each post and pressed willow seeds into the soil. Her fingers worked the earth gently, making small holes, dropping seeds, covering them again. Silas watched and understood. Even if the fence was torn down, the seeds would remain. And in time, they would grow. "Will they root before Saturday?" he asked quietly. "No," she said. "But their children will." She stood and brushed the dirt from her knees, then looked at him with eyes that held both sorrow and resolve. "Thank you for your help. I'll be back tomorrow." "You don't have to, I know," he said. "But I will be." That night in town, the whispers started. Silas stopped at the general store to buy coffee and flour. The place was half full, ranchers finishing their shopping before heading home, a few older men sitting by the stove, even though it was summer and no fire burned. He heard them as soon as he walked in. "Building a fence, I heard, trespassing on railroad land, Apache woman, stirring up trouble. Blocking progress, that's what it is." Silas set his purchases on the counter and waited while the clerk tallied them. The whispers continued behind him, just loud enough to be heard, just quiet enough to feel like secrets. "That woman's got no right. Someone ought to tell her to move along. Sheriff should handle it before Hammond's men do." Silas paid in coins, counted carefully onto the scarred wood. The clerk bagged the coffee and flour without meeting his eyes. As Silas turned to leave, one of the men by the stove spoke louder. "You hear about that Apache woman, Mercer?" Silas stopped. "Heard she's making trouble out by the river." Silas looked at the man, a rancher named Cole, thick through the middle, red-faced from years in the sun and whiskey. "Heard wrong," Silas said evenly. "Railroads got permits. Legal and proper. Legal doesn't always mean right." Cole snorted. "You defending her now?" Silas didn't answer, just picked up his bag and walked out. Behind him, the whispers resumed louder, now speculation turning to certainty, doubt hardening into judgment. But Silas didn't correct anyone, didn't argue, just bought his coffee and rode home through the gathering dark. The next morning he returned to the river before dawn. The camp was quiet, fires just beginning to wake. Ayanna was already at the burial ground, kneeling at the fence line, her hands flat against the earth. Silas dismounted and approached slowly, not wanting to disturb her. but she must have heard him because she spoke without opening her eyes. "You're early." "Couldn't sleep." "Neither could I." He stood behind her watching. She stayed perfectly still, palms pressed to the dirt head, slightly bowed. Her breath was slow and even. Minutes passed. Finally, she opened her eyes and looked up at him. "Do you know what I'm doing, praying, listening?" she said. To what? To what the land wants to say." He frowned, not understanding. She gestured for him to kneel beside her. "Try." He hesitated, then lowered himself to the ground. The earth was cool beneath his knees, damp from morning dew. He felt awkward, uncertain. "Press your hands flat," she instructed. "Like this." He did. The dirt was soft, slightly gritty, still holding the night's coolness. He felt foolish kneeling there in the grass, his rough hands splayed against the ground. "Now close your eyes." He did. "What do you hear?" "Nothing. Just wind." "Listen deeper." He tried, focused. Let the sounds of morning wash over him. The rustle of cottonwood leaves, the murmur of the river, the distant call of a meadowlark. "Still nothing," he admitted. "Then feel," Ayanna said quietly. "Not with your ears, with your hands, with your chest." He exhaled slowly and stopped trying so hard. Let himself simply be present, kneeling in the grass with his hands on the earth. And then gradually he felt it. Not a sound, not a voice, but a presence, a weight. Like the land itself was breathing beneath him, slow and ancient and patient. He felt the coolness of the soil, the way it held moisture, even in summer heat. Felt the roots of grass tangled just beneath the surface, holding everything together. Felt the gravity of time, years upon years, generations upon generations, all compressed into this one small patch of ground. He opened his eyes. Ayanna was watching him, her expression soft. "You felt it." "I don't know what I felt." "Yes, you do." He looked down at his hands still pressed against the earth. They were trembling slightly. "It's like the ground is alive." "It is," she said simply. "And it remembers. Every person who walked here, every prayer spoken, everybody laid to rest. The land holds all of it." Silas stayed kneeling, unable to move, as something inside him cracked open, something that had been sealed shut for years, since his wife died, since the war, since he'd learned that silence was easier than grief. "My wife is buried in town," he said quietly. "I haven't visited her grave in 2 years." Ayanna said nothing, just waited. "I told myself it was because I was busy. Because the ranch needed work. But the truth is," he stopped, swallowed hard. "The truth is I was afraid. Afraid that if I went back, I'd have to feel everything I'd been trying not to feel." And now he looked at her, then at the burial ground surrounded by their fragile fence. "Now I understand why you're fighting. Do you?" "It's not about the dead," he said slowly. "It's about remembering. About refusing to let the people we loved disappear like they never mattered." Ayanna placed her hand over his, still pressed against the earth. Her palm was warm, her grip steady. "The land remembers," she said, "even when we forget. And when we listen, really listen, it reminds us who we are." They stayed like that for a long time, 2 people kneeling in the grass, their hands on the ground, connected by grief and memory, and something deeper than words. And for the first time in years, Silas Mercer stopped thinking about what he'd lost and started thinking about what he still had to protect. Not just land, not just graves, but the act of remembering itself. The refusal to let love be erased by time or progress, or the march of railroad ties across sacred ground. When he finally stood, the sun was fully risen, turning the willow fence golden in the morning light. "I'll be here Saturday," he said. Ayanna stood beside him, brushing dirt from her dress. "So will I. They'll come with shovels, maybe guns. I know, and you'll stand anyway." "I will." He looked at her, this woman who'd given him a stone 25 years ago, who'd taught him to listen to water and earth, who was teaching him still. "Then I'll stand with you," he said. On the 3rd night, Hammond rode into town and nailed a poster to the church door. The sound of the hammer echoed through the empty street, 3 sharp strikes that carried in the stillness. It was past 10 o'clock, and most of the town had shuttered their windows and gone to bed. But a few men lingered outside the saloon, and they saw him do it. By morning, everyone would know. Hammond and Linga. He climbed back on his horse, a tall bay with a branded hip, and rode out the way he'd come, his coat billowing behind him like a shadow. One of the men from the saloon walked over to read what had been posted. He swayed slightly, whiskey slow, and squinted at the paper in the dim light of the street lamp. Then he laughed a short, bitter sound and went back inside. Silas came into town at dawn to pick up supplies. He saw the crowd, first a cluster of people gathered in front of the church, murmuring and pointing. He tied his horse to the rail and walked over. The poster was large, printed in bold black letters on cheap yellow paper. Wanted for arson, Apache woman. Reward $50 crime, setting fire to railroad property and equipment. Last seen Mesquite Bend. Considered dangerous. Report sightings to Hammond Rail Company or County Sheriff. Below the text was a crude sketch, generic enough to be any Apache woman, specific enough to make people look twice at Ayanna if they saw her. Silas's jaw tightened. It was a lie. He knew it the moment he saw it. There had been no fires, no burned equipment, no damage at all except to Hammond's timeline and his pride. But Hammond didn't need truth, he needed an excuse. An excuse to arrest her, to clear the camp, to start digging without interference. Around him the crowd murmured, heard she threatened. The foreman always said those people were trouble. $50 though, that's good money. Sheriff ought to ride out there today. Silas reached up and tore the poster down. The nails screeched as they pulled free from the wood. He crumpled the paper in his fist and walked away, ignoring the stares that followed him. Someone called out, "Hey Mercer, that's railroad property." He didn't stop. He mounted his horse and rode hard to the river, the crumpled poster still clenched in his hand. The sun was barely above the horizon when he reached the camp. Smoke rose from the morning fires, thin and pale against the brightening sky. People moved slowly, still waking, pouring water for coffee, stirring pots, folding blankets. Ayanna sat by her fire, grinding corn in a stone bowl. She looked up when she heard his horse, and something in his face must have told her the news before he spoke. "They're coming for you," Silas said, dismounting fast. He crossed to her in 3 strides and held out the crumpled poster. She set the grinding stone aside and took the paper, smoothing it carefully across her knee. Her eyes scanned the words, her expression unchanging. When she finished, she folded it once, twice, and set it in the fire. The paper blackened and curled flames, eating the lie from the edges inward. "They will burn paper," she said quietly, watching it turn to ash. "We will plant trees. Ayanna, I know what this means. Then you know they'll come for you at dawn. Tomorrow, maybe sooner. I know." Silas knelt beside her, close enough to feel the heat of the fire between them. "Then we leave. Tonight, I'll take you north. There are people in Colorado who'll help places where Hammond's reach doesn't extend." She shook her head. "I won't run from land that holds my family. They'll arrest you. Or worse, let them try." He stared at her, disbelief and frustration rising in his throat. "This isn't a fight you can win." "Maybe not," she said, meeting his eyes, "but it's one I have to stand for." Silas felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been locked for years. A wall built from grief and silence and the belief that caring too much only led to more loss. But sitting here watching this woman choose to stand, even when standing meant losing everything, he realized he'd already lost the fight to stay detached. "Then I won't let them take you," he said, his voice rough. Ayanna's expression softened, just barely. "You can't stop them." "I can try." Why, the question hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Why risk everything for a woman he'd only just remembered, for a people not his own, for a fight that seemed already lost? He looked at the fire, at the ashes of the poster, drifting upward like dark snow. "Because 25 years ago you gave me a stone and told me the river would remember," he said quietly. "And it did. And so did I." Ayanna was silent for a long moment. Then she stood and walked toward the burial ground, her footsteps soft on the dew-wet grass. Silas followed. The willow fence stood in the early light, fragile and green, its woven branches catching the sun. Beyond it the graves lay peaceful beneath their covering of earth and wildflowers, unmarked but not forgotten. Ayanna walked to the oldest willow tree, a massive trunk that had stood for generations, its roots drinking deep from the river. She knelt at its base and pulled a smooth stone from her pocket. Not the one she'd given Silas, but one similar, pale and worn by water. She placed it carefully among the roots, pressing it into the soft earth. Then she closed her eyes and whispered something Silas couldn't hear. He stood a respectful distance away, watching. Her lips moved, forming words in a language he didn't know. Words that sounded like water over stone, like wind through leaves. Her hands rested on her knees, palms up open. The moment stretched. A bird called from the cottonwoods. The river murmured its endless song. The willow branches swayed in a breeze so light Silas barely felt it. When Ayanna finally stood, her eyes were dry but her hands shook. She turned to face him, and in her expression he saw something that made his heart clench. Acceptance, not defeat, not surrender, but the quiet knowledge of someone who'd made peace with what might come. Silas understood. She was saying goodbye, just in case. "What did you say?" he asked quietly. "I thanked them for holding the land. I asked them to forgive me if I fail." She looked at the willow tree, its branches reaching toward the sky. "And I told them I will not leave them alone. You're not failing. We'll see." She walked back toward her tent, moving with the same steady grace she always carried. But Silas could see the weight she bore in the set of her shoulders and the way she kept her spine straight, as if holding herself together by will, alone. He followed her to the fire. The corn she'd been grinding sat abandoned in its bowl. The flames had burned down to coals. "What will you do?" she asked, not looking at him. "I'll go to the sheriff. Show him there's no evidence, no burned equipment. He won't listen. Hammond owns him. Then I'll find someone who will." "Who? The mayor? The judge? They're all on the railroad side. Progress, they call it. Civilization." She poured water over the coals and steam hissed upward. "They've already decided. We're in the way." "Then I'll stand in the way, too." She turned to him, then her eyes searching his face. "You'll lose your land. You're standing in town. Maybe your freedom. I know. For what? For people you barely know. For what's right," he said simply. Ayanna studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. A softening, a recognition. "You're not like the others," she said. "Neither are you." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, gone almost before it appeared. "No, I suppose I'm not." She reached into her tent and pulled out a woven blanket, folded carefully, the pattern geometric and precise diamonds and zigzags in black and white. She held it out to him. "My grandmother made this. She said it holds protection. Keep it." Silas took it, feeling the weight of the wool, the tightness of the weave. "I can't. You can. And you will." Her voice was firm now, brooking no argument. "If they come for me, someone needs to remember what happened here. Someone needs to tell the story. I'll tell it with you. Not after you." "Silas, no." He set the blanket down and took her hands in his rough hands, calloused and scarred, holding hers with a gentleness that surprised them both. "I didn't come back into your life after 25 years just to watch you disappear again." Her breath caught. For a moment she looked like she might pull away. But she didn't. "They'll come at dawn," she said quietly. "Then we have tonight. To do what? To plan. To prepare. To make sure when they come, we're ready." Ayanna looked toward the burial ground, toward the willow fence and the stones beneath the tree. Then she looked back at Silas, and in her eyes he saw something that hadn't been there before. Hope. Fragile like the fence. Uncertain like the seeds planted in dry ground. But there. "All right," she said. "Then, let's begin." They worked through the day and into the evening. Silas rode to his cabin and returned with everything he could carry: rope tools, lanterns, oil. He brought his rifle cleaned and loaded and set it near the tent where Ayanna could reach it. He didn't say it was for protection. He didn't have to. As the sun set, the rest of the camp gathered around the fire. Ayanna spoke to them in Apache, her voice steady and clear. Silas didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. They would stay. They would stand. And if the morning brought trouble, they would face it together. When the meeting ended, the older man, Ayanna's uncle, approached Silas and clasped his shoulder. "Thank you," he said in careful English, "for standing with us." Silas nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. That night he sat by the fire with Ayanna, watching the stars appear one by one above the river. "Do you think they'll really come?" she asked. "Yes. And do you think we can stop them?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think we can make them remember us." Ayanna looked at him, firelight dancing in her dark eyes. "That's enough," she said softly. "That's all we've ever wanted, to be remembered." And in the silence that followed, with the river flowing and the stars watching, Silas Mercer made a promise, not in words but in the way. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. He would not let her face tomorrow alone. Whatever came, they would face it together. Dawn came cold and clear. Hammond arrived with 6 men armed, and Sheriff Clay trailing behind. They carried shovel stakes and a rolled sheet of legal paperwork. Ayanna stood in the center of the burial ground alone. Then Silas stepped out from the trees and stood beside her. Hammond's smile faltered. "Mercer, didn't expect to see you here. Didn't expect you to lie on a wanted poster," Silas said evenly. He pulled a leather ledger from his coat, one he'd borrowed from the county clerk's office the night before. Inside were records of bribes Hammond had paid land. He'd stolen graves. He'd dug up in other territories without permission. Silas handed it to Sheriff Clay. "You want to arrest someone?" Silas said, "Start with him." Hammond's face went red. He reached for his gun. But Silas didn't move, just looked him in the eye. "You shoot," Silas said quietly, "and the river will remember your name." The sheriff drew his own gun, not on Silas, but on Hammond. "Put it down, Hammond." For a moment no one breathed. Then Hammond lowered his weapon, cursed, turned his horse and rode. The crew followed. Sheriff Clay tipped his hat to Ayanna. "We'll look into this, ma'am." Then he left too. Silence settled over the burial ground. Ayanna pulled a red thread from her wrist and tied it carefully to the brim of Silas's hat next to the stone. "Now the river knows both of us," she said. A week later, the railroad announced a route change. The burial ground would remain untouched. Hammond was transferred to another territory. His name was quietly removed from company records. Silas helped rebuild the willow fence, this time with stronger posts. Ayanna planted white wildflowers around each grave, marker symbols of renewal, she said. One morning they sat together by the river, coffee boiling over a small fire. The light was soft golden, reflected in the water like scattered coins. Ayanna didn't speak, neither did Silas. But when she reached out and touched the stone on his hat, and when he placed his hand over hers, no words were needed. They had fought for this ground together. They had stood when others walked away. And now, in the quiet that followed, they understood what it meant to belong not to a place, but to a promise. The river flowed. The wind carried warmth instead of dust. And somewhere beneath the willow trees, memory and love grew roots. If you're drawn to stories of cowboys' Wild West love and the kind of cowboy love stories that speak to the soul, remember to like and share. These Wild West stories carry the heartbeat of a time when love was measured not in words, but in the willingness to stand beside someone when the world said to walk away.